The sound of an excavator's engine roars to life, shaking the ground beneath. You hear the metallic scrape of the bucket as it digs into the earth, kicking up dust and dirt. The camera cuts to an old, rundown workshop, once a proud structure, now a shadow of its former self. Its walls, aged by time and weather, crumble as the heavy machine pushes against them. A cloud of debris fills the air, and the building begins to collapse in slow motion, as if in resignation. Suddenly, the excavator halts. The sound of its machinery stops. The camera zooms in on a strange glint of metal, partially uncovered by the digging. The earth around it shifts, revealing more of the object, now unmistakably metallic. The excavation crew stands still, staring at what appears to be a buried, rusted mass of some kind. One of the workers steps forward cautiously, brushes off the remaining dirt, and peers at it. His face shows confusion, then amazement. The camera cuts to Jonah Hillman, a grizzled man in his late 50s, watching from a distance. His face is hardened, but his eyes, though tired, are wide with disbelief. This old piece of land, this worthless plot he had come to terms with losing, is about to give up a secret he never could have imagined. The geologist standing next to Jonah examines the find closely. "Sir," he says, his voice low but filled with awe, "did you know you're sitting on a $2 billion rare earth deposit?" Jonah's mouth goes dry, his eyes narrow as if he's hearing a joke that's too surreal to be true. The camera holds on his face for a moment, allowing the weight of the discovery to sink in. This is not just some forgotten relic from the past. This is a treasure buried under his feet. Something he thought was useless and obsolete is now worth more than anything he could have imagined. Cut to a wide shot of the land, the construction equipment surrounding the workshop's ruins. The sound of a bulldozer kicking up more dirt reverberates in the air. Jonah stands there, rooted in place, the weight of this revelation pressing down on him. The workshop, the place he had spent decades building and fixing things, was being demolished to make room for condos. And now, just beneath it, sat something so valuable it could change his life forever. Jonah's thoughts race. The decision to sell the land had been simple before, a quiet surrender, the land's value dwindling as the city around him developed. But now everything was different. Everything was upended. He was sitting on a literal gold mine, and he hadn't even known it. The years of hard work, the moments of loss, the quiet retirement had all led to this point. Everything he thought was lost now seemed like it was part of something much bigger. Jonah takes a slow, deliberate breath, the camera lingering on him as the discovery settles in. The sound of machinery begins to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of possibilities. His life, his family's future, all of it is now at a crossroads. And then Jonah breaks the silence with a voice filled with quiet shock. This changes everything. Narrator, voiceover. My nephew demolished my worthless old workshop to build condos. He thought it was just junk, but what they discovered under that pile of dust, it's worth billions. And the real shocker? I had no idea what I was sitting on. Before the tension can build further, Jonah speaks again. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. This is only the beginning, and already the audience knows this is no ordinary story. What happens next will change everything Jonah thought he knew about his life, his family, and the land beneath his feet. Before everything changed, life was simple for Jonah Hillman. For decades, he had lived in the same modest house on the outskirts of town, a place that felt like home in every sense. The house was nothing flashy, just a small, weathered property with a sprawling backyard that led to his most cherished possession, the workshop. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a few creaky wooden beams, a rusted roof, and walls covered in peeling paint. But to Jonah, it was the heart of his world. Jonah had spent his entire life working with his hands. From a young age, he'd learned the trade from his father, who had built a small reputation as a craftsman and fixer in the community. Jonah followed in his father's footsteps, and over the years, he had perfected his skills. He had restored furniture, built and repaired old cars, and taken on countless projects that others had deemed too difficult. His reputation as a quiet, reliable worker spread, and people came from miles around to ask for his help. But Jonah didn't do it for the praise. For him, it was about the satisfaction of bringing something old, broken, and forgotten back to life. It was about the feeling of accomplishment when a project was finished, when he could stand back and admire the result of his hard work. The workshop wasn't just a place to work, it was a sanctuary. It was where Jonah could escape, where the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. It was his refuge after long days of work. Family had always been at the center of Jonah's life, too. He had married Margaret, the love of his life, when they were young. Together, they built a life based on mutual respect and a shared love of hard work. Their children grew up in this house, and Jonah spent years teaching them about the value of craftsmanship, just as his father had taught him. The workshop was a symbol of everything Jonah held dear: the bond between father and son, the importance of family, and the quiet, unspoken love that ran through the heart of everything he did. But over time, things changed. The kids grew older and moved away, chasing their own dreams in cities, far from the small town where Jonah had spent his life. As they became more distant, so did their relationship with Jonah. Phone calls grew infrequent, visits rarer. Margaret passed away a few years ago after a long battle with illness, leaving Jonah alone in the house he had built with her, surrounded by memories. The workshop, once a place filled with laughter and shared moments, felt quieter now. Jonah continued to work, but it was no longer the same. He often found himself lingering longer than he should, wishing for the days when the house had felt full. It was in these quiet moments of solitude that Jonah began to sense a shift, a slow erosion of the life he had known. His nephew Lucas started visiting less, and when he did, it was usually only for brief check-ins. The younger generation, it seemed, no longer had the same appreciation for the old ways. The workshop, with its time-worn tools and old-fashioned charm, seemed out of place in a world where everything was becoming modern and new. For Jonah, it was a bittersweet realization. The world had moved on, and he, along with his beloved workshop, was slowly being forgotten. The quiet hum of his former life, filled with purpose and fulfillment, had been replaced by the hollow sounds of an uncertain future. Little did Jonah know he was about to lose far more than just the fading connection with his family. He was about to lose everything he thought was unimportant, only to discover that everything he held dear was worth more than he could ever have imagined. The first real sign that things weren't as they seemed came during a casual conversation one afternoon. Jonah was sitting in his workshop working on restoring an old wooden chair when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps crunching across the gravel driveway. He looked up to see his nephew Lucas approaching, hands in his pockets, a faint air of distraction about him. Jonah hadn't seen Lucas much lately, but the boy had always been a part of the family. He'd grown up visiting Jonah's workshop on weekends, learning the basics of woodwork and asking questions that Jonah was always happy to answer. The boy had potential, Jonah thought, but something had changed in him. "Hey, Uncle Jonah," Lucas greeted, trying to hide the annoyance in his voice, but it was there. "I've been talking to Dad, and we think it's about time you let go of this place." Jonah's brow furrowed. He set the chair down gently, wiping his hands on a rag before standing up to meet Lucas. The young man was wearing a hoodie and jeans, his face hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. He looked like he was in a hurry, distracted, his thoughts somewhere else. "What do you mean, let go?" Jonah asked. His voice was steady, though there was a tinge of confusion. "This place isn't just a building, Lucas. It's where I've spent most of my life. It's where your grandfather worked, where I worked with your dad." Lucas shifted his weight, uneasily, glancing over the workshop as if it were an old relic rather than the heart of Jonah's world. "I get that, Uncle, but it's kind of falling apart and, well, things are changing around here. The land's worth more than the building now, and we could sell it to developers. Your place is in a prime location for condos." Jonah's chest tightened, though he tried not to show it. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind. The workshop was everything to him. Sure, it was old. Sure, there were leaks in the roof and the floorboards creaked. But to Jonah, it was a piece of his history, his identity. To Lucas, it was a piece of property, waiting to be sold off to the highest bidder. "I've been fixing this place up for years, Lucas. I'm not selling. It's not about the money. It's about my legacy." Jonah's voice was firm now, more than he intended. He'd worked too hard to just let it go. Lucas didn't seem convinced. He shifted again, glancing back at the house in the distance. "I understand, Uncle Jonah, I do. But you're not getting any younger. Maybe it's time to think about something else. This place isn't going to last forever, and neither are you." There it was, the dismissive tone that Jonah had begun to feel creeping in over the past few years. The words stung more than he expected. "Maybe I don't need to change just yet," Jonah replied quietly. "This workshop is mine. I've built my life around it." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet. After a long pause, he let out a small, forced chuckle. "All right, I get it. Just think about it, okay? You know what's best for you." But Jonah could see the indifference in Lucas's eyes. There was no passion for what Jonah had built, no respect for the years of work and memories. As Lucas walked away, Jonah stood in the doorway of his workshop, watching him go. A cold wind blew through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, Jonah felt a deep, gnawing sense of unease. Was it just a casual suggestion, or was something more serious afoot? He didn't know yet, but something told him that this conversation was just the beginning. The first red flag had been raised, and Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to be the last. He had always known that nothing lasted forever, but he hadn't expected his own family to be the ones to push him out of the place he loved most. The small cuts, the quiet dismissals, the slow erosion of his sense of worth, Jonah felt it all, though he tried his best to ignore it. Each day that passed seemed to chip away at the edges of his identity. He had always prided himself on his work, his dedication, and his connection to the land. But now the world around him was changing in ways he couldn't control, and it felt as though his place in it was shrinking. Jonah started to notice it in the little things. For example, when his son David called, it was always brief. There was no longer the enthusiasm in their conversations that once existed. David had a busy life of his own now, his own family, his own job, his own struggles. And Jonah understood that, to some extent. He had done the same when he was younger, leaving home to start his own path. But now, it seemed like the distance between them was more than just physical. It felt like a wall had been built. Jonah tried to reach out with reminders of the past, hoping to rekindle something. "Remember when you helped me restore that old truck? It's still running strong, you know." But his attempts to reconnect were met with silence or short responses. "Yeah, that's great, Dad," David would say. "I've got to go. Call you later?" And that was it. Jonah's heart ached each time. He didn't want to seem needy, so he buried his feelings and stayed silent, telling himself that his son was busy with his own life. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel that his role in the family had faded, just as the old workshop was slowly decaying. Even Lucas's visits became rarer. When he did stop by, it was often to ask for something, advice on a project, or to discuss a business deal that Jonah didn't quite understand. The conversations were transactional, lacking the warmth they once had. The same boy who had once asked Jonah to teach him how to repair a broken chair now seemed to view him more as a relic than a mentor. In the quiet of his workshop, Jonah would sit for hours, his hands still, but his mind racing. He had always found peace in the sound of his tools, the rhythmic motions of fixing something, but now that sound was punctuated by an unsettling silence. The world outside was changing rapidly. New buildings were going up in the area, the town was growing, and Jonah felt as though he was being left behind. It wasn't just the physical changes, it was the emotional distance he felt from the people he loved. He could hear the sound of construction equipment in the distance, the clang of metal on metal, as new buildings rose around him. The land that once felt so full of possibility now seemed so empty, as though everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was fading into obscurity. Even the earth beneath his feet, once solid and constant, felt like it was slipping away. Jonah had always been proud of his independence, of his ability to make his own way in the world. But now, with each passing day, that pride seemed to erode a little more. He was no longer the man everyone turned to for guidance. Instead, he was a quiet figure, unnoticed, forgotten. The man who once thrived in his own workshop now found himself alone, with only the memories of what had been. And yet there was something stirring within him, an ember of defiance that refused to go out. It was small, but Jonah could feel it. The pain was deep, but it wasn't the end. He wasn't done yet. The day Jonah realized how deeply he had been disregarded came at a family gathering. It wasn't a big event, just a small barbecue in the backyard of his brother Stan's house, a casual get-together with a few relatives. Jonah had been invited, though the invitation felt more like a formality than a true desire for his presence. It had been a while since they'd all gathered, and Jonah could tell his absence hadn't been felt. He arrived early, hoping to catch up with everyone, but as the day wore on, it became clear that his presence wasn't exactly welcome. Lucas was there, of course, along with Stan and Jonah's two nieces. The usual pleasantries were exchanged, but the conversation quickly shifted to other topics. The family spoke about their busy lives, about the kids' new schools, about Stan's latest business venture. Jonah tried to participate, offering his thoughts, but it felt like his voice was being drowned out by the others. At one point, he made a joke about his latest project in the workshop, expecting a laugh. Instead, the room fell silent for a moment before Lucas awkwardly cleared his throat and changed the subject. Jonah felt a flush of heat rise in his face. Was it his age? His voice? The way his clothes were a little worn, his hair a little grayer than it used to be? He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something had shifted. The easy camaraderie of the past had evaporated, replaced by a thin layer of politeness that seemed to grow colder with every minute. The true sting came later, as the evening wore on. Jonah had retreated to the back porch, standing alone with his glass of iced tea, looking out over the garden. He could hear the muffled sound of laughter from inside the house, and he felt the isolation creep in again. He was just about to turn in for the night when he overheard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Lucas and Stan were talking in hushed voices just around the corner. Jonah's curiosity got the better of him, and he crept closer to listen. "Why does he even hang on to that place?" Lucas said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The old workshop? It's falling apart. It's a joke. Dad and I were just talking about it. It's time to get rid of it. The place is just sitting there, worth nothing but a bunch of rotting wood and rust." Jonah felt like the breath had been knocked out of him. The words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know why, but the realization that his family, his own flesh and blood, saw him and his workshop that way cut deep. The workshop that had been his sanctuary, his pride, his life's work, was nothing more than a joke to them. He stood frozen, his heart racing. He wanted to confront them, to shout, to make them understand. But something held him back. Instead, he turned away quietly, retreating into the shadows of the night. There was no point in confronting them. They had already made up their minds. That evening, as Jonah lay in bed, The sting of humiliation settled deep within him. He wasn't just ignored, he was dismissed. His life's work, his memories, his entire sense of self seemed to have been reduced to nothing more than an inconvenient relic. He was no longer relevant, and it was all happening without him even being aware of it. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the lack of respect, the quiet dismissal of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd loved. In that moment, Jonah understood something fundamental. He had been erased. The next few weeks felt like a slow unraveling for Jonah. He was no longer the man his family turned to for advice or support. After that humiliating conversation overheard at Stan's house, the cracks in the foundation of his relationships became too obvious to ignore. Jonah started to feel like a ghost in his own life, a bystander, watching as the world around him continued without him. His family's distance was more than just physical. It was emotional, like they had written him off as irrelevant, someone who no longer fit into the picture they were painting of their lives. Lucas's visits became fewer, and when he did show up, it was always for something specific. "Uncle Jonah, I need your advice on a project," or "Hey, can you look at this blueprint?" But it wasn't genuine. The words felt rehearsed, the questions shallow. There was no warmth in them, no real interest in Jonah himself, only in what he could offer. That had always been the dynamic between them. But now, it was even more apparent. Jonah could feel the growing resentment, the sense that he was only valued when he was useful. Even though Jonah's workshop had once been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape, it began to feel like a prison. The things that had once brought him peace now reminded him of the life he had lost. The rusting tools, the half-finished projects, they all felt like symbols of a past that no one seemed to care about anymore. The sound of his hands working on wood and metal, which once brought him so much satisfaction, now only deepened his sense of isolation. He was alone, surrounded by the remnants of his past, and he didn't know how much longer he could endure the silence. One morning, Jonah woke up with a quiet resolve. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that things would magically go back to the way they used to be. He had tried. He had tried to reach out to Lucas, to his brother, to his son. But it was clear now, they had moved on without him. He wasn't part of their future anymore. The thought struck him harder than he expected. But Jonah wasn't angry. He wasn't fighting for attention or love anymore. He had been pushed aside, but there was no need to make a scene. He gathered a few things, the personal items that meant the most to him. Photos of his late wife, Margaret, some of the small tools that had been passed down to him by his father. Without a word, he packed up what little he needed and quietly left the house. Jonah didn't make a grand exit. He didn't tell anyone where he was going or why. He simply walked away. It wasn't anger driving him, just a quiet, deep sadness. He didn't need to confront them. The decision had already been made for him. The family he had devoted his life to had left him behind. He had nothing left to prove. As Jonah drove away, leaving the only life he had known behind, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't the end. There was still something in him, something that refused to be extinguished. The spark was still there. It might have been small, but it was there, burning quietly beneath the surface. It wasn't over yet. Jonah's decision to leave wasn't a grand gesture or a bold declaration of independence. It wasn't even a plan. It was just a quiet surrender to the reality that his life as he knew it had come to an end. But when he left, the world around him didn't stop. It just kept moving forward, as though Jonah had never been part of it in the first place. And that's when he realized just how far he had fallen. The small trailer he moved into, on the edge of his property, felt like a far cry from the home he had built with Margaret. The trailer was cold and impersonal, with bare walls and the hum of a small heater in the corner that never quite warmed the place. He barely left it. There was no point in seeing the family anymore. They had made it clear that he was no longer needed in their lives. So Jonah withdrew further into his solitude, retreating from everything. The days blurred together. He spent his time tinkering with a few small projects, fixing up old tools, restoring a piece of furniture here and there. But even that felt hollow. He wasn't doing it for joy anymore. It was just something to pass the time. The work didn't offer the satisfaction it once had, the sense of accomplishment. Now it was just a way to keep himself busy, to avoid the deafening silence of his life. The ache of loneliness crept in deeper as the months wore on. Jonah hadn't realized how much of his identity had been tied to his family and the work he'd done. Without them, he was adrift. The idea of his workshop being demolished, of all his memories slowly fading away under the weight of development, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the loss of a building, it was the loss of everything he had ever known. At night, he would lie in bed staring at the ceiling of the trailer. He could hear the sounds of the town outside, the hum of cars, the distant chatter of people, the occasional sound of construction in the distance. But here, in his tiny space, everything felt hollow. The world had gone on without him, and Jonah realized that he was no longer a part of it. One evening, after a long day of aimless work, Jonah sat at the small table in the corner of the trailer, his head in his hands. He hadn't had a real conversation with anyone in months. No one had checked in on him. No one asked how he was doing. There was just the growing emptiness, the crushing weight of being invisible in a world that was moving too fast. For the first time in his life, Jonah felt utterly and completely alone. The walls of the trailer felt like they were closing in on him. He had no one left to turn to. His family was gone, his legacy was being bulldozed, and he had no idea what was next. He had reached rock bottom. But as he sat there in the quiet, something stirred inside him, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The pain was undeniable, but it wasn't the end. It wasn't the final chapter. The fire hadn't completely gone out. It might have dimmed, but it was still there, smoldering beneath the ashes. Jonah had hit rock bottom, but for the first time he realized something. The only way from here was up. It was a crisp autumn morning when Jonah received the unexpected call. The sound of his phone ringing echoed through the empty trailer, its jarring tone breaking through the silence that had become his constant companion. At first he hesitated. The last thing he wanted was another business call or some well-meaning but distant relative asking how he was holding up. Still, the call persisted. Jonah glanced at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. He let the phone ring a few more times, then sighed and picked it up. "Jonah Hillman," he answered gruffly. "Mr. Hillman?" The voice on the other end was professional but warm. "This is Dr. Evelyn Foster, a geologist working with a team on your land. We've come across something unusual. I was hoping to speak with you about it." Jonah sat up straighter, the dull weight of his depression momentarily lifting as he processed her words. "Unusual?" he repeated, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Well, we're doing some preliminary work in preparation for the condo development, but while our crew was digging near the southern end of your property, we discovered something metal. At first, we thought it was just old debris, but after some preliminary checks, it's not like anything we've seen before. I'd like to come out and show you." Jonah's heart raced. He had no idea what this woman was talking about, but the words, "something metal," piqued his curiosity. The land he had lived on for so many years, the very land that had always felt like it was slipping through his fingers, was suddenly drawing attention. But to what end? "All right," Jonah said, finally finding his voice. "I'll meet you there in an hour." An hour later, Jonah drove slowly down the familiar road toward his property. The trailer was small, hidden away at the far edge of the land. The closer he got, the more a strange feeling gnawed at him. Why had a geologist called him? What could possibly be buried under the earth that was worth a professional's attention? When he arrived, Dr. Foster was already there, standing by a group of workers. The area around them was cordoned off, and several excavators and trucks were parked nearby. Jonah's eyes flicked to the site where the earth had been torn open. He saw what looked like a large metallic object, partially uncovered in the dirt, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. "What is that?" Jonah asked, his voice quiet. Dr. Foster turned to face him, her expression serious but not alarmed. "We don't know yet, but what we do know is that it's not just scrap metal. This is something rare, something significant." Jonah took a cautious step forward, staring at the object. "What do you mean, significant?" "The readings we've taken suggest that this is a massive deposit of rare earth elements buried right beneath the surface. And by the looks of it, this could be worth billions." Jonah's heart skipped a beat. Billions. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. He had always known that his land was valuable, the location was prime for development, but this was something entirely different. Jonah stood there, frozen, as the enormity of the discovery sank in. He was no longer just an old man with a fading workshop. He was standing on a potential gold mine, and he hadn't even known it. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His life, as he knew it, was about to change. Dr. Foster's voice broke through his shock. "Mr. Hillman, I need to ask, do you have any idea what you're sitting on?" Jonah swallowed hard, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what she was saying. "No," he muttered, his voice low. "No idea." As the days passed, Jonah found himself unable to shake the discovery from his mind. What had once felt like a slow descent into irrelevance had now exploded into the most unexpected of opportunities. The land he had spent years neglecting and even longer trying to preserve was now a treasure trove. Jonah had always thought of his workshop as his life's work, his legacy. But in that moment, it felt like everything had changed. The real value wasn't in the crumbling walls of the workshop, it was in the earth beneath his feet. Jonah wasn't sure if the realization hit him gradually or all at once, but he started seeing things differently. Before the discovery, he'd been resigned to his fading place in the world, consumed by the emptiness left by his wife's passing and his family's growing distance. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the spark of something new, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. That spark, however, was not something he could ignore. It was like a flame flickering in the dark, urging him to pay attention. He spent the next few days at the site, speaking with Dr. Foster and the excavation team, learning as much as he could about the rare earth deposit hidden beneath his land. Jonah found himself coming alive with each passing conversation. He was no longer just a man hanging on to memories. He was a man standing on the brink of something far bigger, something that could give him the future he'd thought was out of reach. At night, Jonah sat in the small trailer, the world outside a quiet, lonely place. But the unease that had once accompanied his solitude was now replaced by a new kind of energy. Jonah began thinking, planning, dreaming. What could he do with this discovery? He had no idea how to extract rare earth elements or what the process would involve, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he finally had something to offer, something with real, tangible value. He spent hours researching, reading about mining and the global demand for rare earth elements. Jonah had never been a businessman, but now he felt the pull of the opportunity. He couldn't ignore it. This discovery was his chance to reclaim the life he thought had slipped through his fingers. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming his place in the world, about taking control of something that was his for the first time in years. The next day, Jonah made a decision. He would no longer wait for things to happen. He would take the reins of his own future. He called the excavation team and began making arrangements for a formal survey of the land. He reached out to local business contacts, looking into potential investors and the possibility of turning the rare earth deposit into a sustainable operation. Most importantly, he started to see himself differently. He was no longer the forgotten, sidelined man. He was an integral part of something monumental. Jonah's awakening was quiet, but it was fierce. The fire that had once dimmed within him flared back to life. The man who had been ignored for so long was now a man with a future, and this time he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. Jonah didn't announce his plans to anyone, not to his family, not to Lucas, not even to the handful of people who still occasionally checked in on him. He had learned the hard way that his life wasn't meant to be shared with others, not when they didn't understand what mattered most to him. This new chapter was his, and it was unfolding quietly behind the scenes. Jonah knew he couldn't afford to make a spectacle of it. This wasn't a moment to share with the world. It was a moment to quietly build something, to prepare, to set the foundation for what was coming. So, while the world around him continued to spin, Jonah began to work. Every day, he would go to the land, meeting with geologists, mining experts, and investors who might help him unlock the potential of the rare earth deposit beneath his feet. He made calls, sometimes at odd hours, and spent hours researching every detail of the process. He wasn't a businessman, but he knew that this was an opportunity too big to ignore. Jonah understood that his work now was about more than just the land or the deposit. It was about the decisions he made, how he managed this discovery, who he trusted, and, most importantly, how he would turn this fortune into something lasting. He didn't speak to anyone in his family about it. It wasn't out of spite, but rather a deep need to do something for himself, a way to prove that he wasn't just the forgotten man, the old relative who had been left behind. For years he had been living in their shadow, overlooked and dismissed. But now, with the potential of this discovery, Jonah realized he had a chance to take control of his own story. One night, while he sat in his trailer with a notepad full of plans and figures, he glanced over at the photograph of Margaret sitting on the shelf beside him. It had been a long time since he'd thought about her, without the ache of loneliness. She had always been there for him, supporting him through every tough time. And now, as he stared at her picture, he felt like she was with him still, urging him to take this opportunity. "I'm doing this for us, Margaret," he whispered, as if she could hear him. He had always taken pride in his work, but for the first time, Jonah felt like he was doing something that was truly his. This wasn't for anyone else, and it wasn't about proving a point. It was about rebuilding something for himself, something that would give him the strength to move forward, to finally stand tall. Jonah's silent setup was working. Each decision, each meeting, each quiet step he took was bringing him closer to the future he had always imagined, but never thought possible. His family was still unaware of what he was doing, but soon enough, the truth would come out. When it did, Jonah would be ready. He wasn't rushing. He was moving with purpose, one careful decision at a time. He was no longer sitting idly by, waiting for things to happen. Jonah had finally taken control. Jonah didn't need to announce his plans for the world to start noticing. Slowly, word began to spread, and the changes around him were unmistakable. While Jonah kept his movements quiet, his actions were speaking louder than any words could. The discovery of the rare earth deposit on his land was beginning to ripple through the local business community, and Jonah's name started appearing in the right circles. He hadn't reached out to his family yet, but the growing buzz around his property made it inevitable. Jonah's first step was to contact a mining consulting firm to get a full analysis of the site. They sent a team to perform a geological survey, and as the results came in, the true scale of the deposit became clearer. It wasn't just a small find. It was massive. The deposit stretched deep into the earth, and its worth was far greater than Jonah could have imagined. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as worthless land by his family was now a valuable asset that had the potential to shape the future of his life. Behind the scenes, Jonah started working with investors who were eager to get involved. The rare earth market was growing, and there was increasing demand for these minerals, especially with the rise of the electric vehicles, renewable energy, and high-tech industries. Jonah wasn't naive. He knew this was a complex business, one that required expertise. But he had made the decision to build a team of professionals who could help him navigate the process. With the right people in place, he would take charge of this discovery in a way that would not only benefit him financially, but also secure a legacy that was his own, one that was independent of his family's expectations. At the same time, Jonah's relationship with his family was changing, whether they realized it or not. His brother Stan, who had always been more interested in money than family, started reaching out. At first, it was casual, a phone call here and there asking about Jonah's well-being, but as soon as Stan caught wind of the discovery, the tone of his calls changed. "Jonah, I heard about the deposit," Stan said one evening, his voice tight with interest. "You know, I could help you with this. I've got some contacts in the business world. We could partner up, make this thing really work." Jonah wasn't surprised. Stan had always been about opportunities, not family. But what struck Jonah wasn't just Stan's sudden eagerness to be involved, it was how quickly he had forgotten the dismissive way he had treated Jonah not long ago. The same man who had dismissed the workshop as worthless was now acting as if he had been Jonah's greatest ally all along. "I've got it covered, Stan," Jonah replied calmly, his voice steady. "I don't need anyone's help right now, but thanks for reaching out." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Stan cleared his throat. "All right, Jonah, just remember, I'm here if you change your mind." Jonah hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the vast expanse of land that had become so much more than just property to him. He wasn't angry with Stan. He had expected this. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the power was now in his hands. The power shift was subtle, but it was unmistakable. People were starting to look at Jonah differently. No longer was he the quiet, overlooked man on the sidelines. He was the one with the land that held a multi-billion-dollar treasure beneath it. His family's disregard had turned into quiet envy, and Jonah could feel the shift. But what was most important was how Jonah felt about himself. For the first time in years, he was standing tall, with the future firmly in his grasp. He didn't need approval. He didn't need validation. The power had shifted, and Jonah was finally in control of his own story. The day Jonah decided to confront his family, he wasn't angry. He wasn't seeking revenge or trying to prove a point. He simply felt that it was time. Time to stop letting his family walk all over him. Time to stop being invisible. Time to stand tall and take control of his own narrative. They had dismissed him for too long, and now, with everything changing, Jonah knew it was time to reclaim his space. It started with a phone call to Stan. Jonah had debated the best way to approach this. He could have sent a formal letter, or he could have let things continue the way they were. But Jonah had never been one for games or subtlety. He wanted to be clear, direct, and honest. "Stan, I need you to come over today. We need to talk," Jonah said, his voice steady. "Sure thing, Jonah," Stan replied, a hint of curiosity in his tone. Jonah could tell that his brother wasn't quite sure what this meeting was going to be about, but he'd soon find out. A couple of hours later, Stan arrived at Jonah's trailer. His face was tense, as if he could feel the gravity of the conversation that was coming. Jonah gestured for him to sit, but instead of a warm welcome, there was only the awkward silence that had been creeping between them for so long. "I've been thinking a lot," Jonah began, looking Stan in the eye, "about everything, about the workshop, about the land, about our family." Stan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Jonah continued without waiting for a response. "I know you've always had your own ideas about what should happen with the land, and I've seen how you've treated me, how you and Lucas have dismissed the workshop as worthless, as something that doesn't matter." Jonah's voice didn't rise. It wasn't filled with anger, just a quiet clarity. "But I need you to understand something. This place, this land, it's more than just some old building to me. And now, because of what's buried beneath it, it's more than just a plot of land for some condos. Stan opened his mouth to speak, but Jonah held up a hand. "Let me finish," Jonah said, his tone firm but controlled. "I've been working quietly, not because I need your approval, but because this is mine. The land, the deposit beneath it, it's mine, and I'm going to make something of it. I've already been meeting with investors. I'm not asking for your help. I don't need it." There was a long silence. Jonah could see the shock on Stan's face, the realization that his brother had not only known about the rare earth deposit, but had already begun moving forward with it without involving anyone else. This was Jonah's moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I'm not the man you thought I was," Jonah added quietly, his voice steady. "I'm not someone you can ignore anymore. This is my future now, and if you want to be part of it, you'll have to come to me with respect, not demands." Stan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jonah watched him carefully, not with anger, but with calm resolution. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to plead. He was simply stating the truth. "I hope you understand," Jonah said, standing up from the table. "I'm done being invisible." Stan remained silent, still processing the weight of Jonah's words. He stood up slowly, nodding once. It wasn't an apology, but it was the beginning of understanding. Jonah didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. What mattered now was that he had spoken his truth, and he had done it on his terms. For the first time in a long time, Jonah felt like the power was finally in his hands. Jonah's confrontation with Stan had been a quiet yet powerful moment, one where he had taken back control of his own story. But what came next was a complete twist, one that neither Jonah nor his family could have ever predicted. Weeks passed after that meeting, and though Jonah continued to move forward with his plans, the tension with his family lingered. Stan hadn't reached out again, and Lucas had been conspicuously absent from Jonah's life. But Jonah didn't dwell on it. He was too focused on the future, too consumed by the progress he was making with the rare earth deposit to care about what his family thought. He knew they would come around. They had no choice. This discovery had shifted everything, and Jonah was going to be the one to benefit from it. Then, out of nowhere, the phone call came. It wasn't from Stan. It wasn't from Lucas. It wasn't even from an investor or business associate. It was from Dr. Evelyn Foster, the geologist who had first uncovered the rare earth deposit. Her voice was strained, almost urgent. "Jonah, you need to meet me. There's something you need to know, and I'm afraid it's urgent." Jonah felt a wave of unease wash over him as he agreed to meet her. He had no idea what she was about to tell him, but the sudden shift in her tone told him that something had gone wrong. When Jonah arrived at the site, Dr. Foster was standing near the excavation equipment, looking more serious than Jonah had ever seen her. The workers had stopped digging for the day, and the area was unusually quiet. "Jonah, I'm afraid there's been an issue," Dr. Foster began, her eyes darting nervously to the workers around her. "It's about the deposit. After some additional testing, we've uncovered something alarming." Jonah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Dr. Foster paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. "It's not just rare earth elements beneath your land, Jonah. We've discovered that this site contains a significant amount of lithium as well, an incredibly valuable resource for the production of electric vehicle batteries. And there's something even more crucial. The deposit is rich enough to make this one of the largest lithium reserves in the world. It could change the global supply chain, and the implications are massive." Jonah stood frozen. He had been focused on the rare earth elements, but this was something else entirely. Lithium, a game changer. His land was now worth more than he could have ever dreamed. It wasn't just a few $1,000,000 or even $1 billion. It was an entire industry's worth of potential. But as the magnitude of the discovery sank in, Jonah's mind began to race. Who else knew about this? He hadn't shared this information with anyone except Dr. Foster and a small circle of trusted professionals. And yet, the moment the discovery became known, the world would come running. At that moment, Jonah understood what had happened. Stan, who had been trying to get into Jonah's good graces, had likely heard rumors about the lithium. He was already in talks with developers, and as much as Jonah didn't want to believe it, he suspected that his brother had been keeping tabs on him for a while. The same man who had dismissed Jonah's land was now desperate to profit from it. Jonah felt the weight of his own foresight. His family had underestimated him, and now the tables had completely turned. He had no intention of letting anyone take control of what was rightfully his. The fight for his future wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. This was Jonah's moment, the moment when everything he had worked for would be realized, and no one, not even his family, would be able to take it from him. The twist was more than just a surprise. It was the final blow of justice Jonah had been waiting for, the proof that he had always had the power to shape his own destiny. As Jonah's new venture began to gain momentum, his life shifted in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. His reputation was growing, not just locally, but in industries far beyond the construction and real estate circles he had once inhabited. The discovery of the lithium deposit had turned his once humble piece of land into a global asset, and his role in the process was undeniable. Yet, with all this success, there was something Jonah hadn't expected: the sudden reappearance of his family. It was a few months after the big reveal that Jonah received a call from his son, David. Jonah hadn't heard from David in what felt like forever. The last time they spoke was short and distant, and Jonah had started to wonder if their relationship could ever be repaired. David had his own life, his own family, and Jonah had accepted that his role in it had diminished. But now, something was different. "Dad, I need to talk." David's voice was cautious, but there was an urgency beneath it. "Can we meet?" Jonah had no idea what this was about, but he agreed. They met at the same diner where they'd had so many father-son talks when David was younger. It was the kind of place Jonah hadn't visited in years, but it felt oddly comforting as he sat in the familiar booth, waiting for his son. When David walked in, Jonah couldn't help but notice how much he had changed. David wasn't the boy who used to look up at him with admiration and curiosity. He was now a man, more serious and world-weary. But there was a glimmer of something Jonah hadn't seen in years: respect. David sat down slowly, his eyes avoiding Jonah's for a moment, and when he finally looked up, there was a strange mixture of guilt and hope in his expression. "I know I haven't been around much," David started, his voice tight. "I've been caught up in my own stuff, but I've been hearing a lot about you, about the land, about the discovery. I had no idea. Dad, I'm sorry, I should have reached out sooner." Jonah leaned back in his chair, studying his son. This wasn't the usual apology, the kind that came out of obligation. David's words seemed genuine, and for the first time in a long time, Jonah felt a flicker of the connection they once shared. "Yeah, I heard about it too," David continued, a slight nervous laugh escaping him. "Everyone's talking about it. I guess it took me by surprise. I didn't think you had it in you to do something this big. But I'm proud of you, Dad. I think we all are, even if we haven't said it." Jonah's chest tightened, not with bitterness, but with a complex mixture of emotions. The years of neglect, the distance, the quiet erasure of his presence, they were all still there, lingering like ghosts. But hearing his son say he was proud of him struck something deep inside. "I've spent a lot of time thinking, Dad," David said, his voice softer now. "I've been wrong. I didn't understand before, but I get it now. You weren't just holding onto that land for no reason. You've built something real, and it's yours. I want to help you with this if you'll let me." Jonah's heart swelled, but he didn't speak right away. He had to be sure this wasn't just about the money, about the sudden influx of opportunity that had come with his discovery. He had been hurt too many times to just accept this without question. "I'm not doing this for anyone else, David," Jonah finally said, his voice steady. "But if you want to be part of it, you need to show me you're here for the right reasons. Not because it's valuable, but because it's important. This is more than just business for me." David nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. "I get it, Dad. I'm in it for the right reasons. Let me prove it." In that moment, Jonah saw something he hadn't seen in years: hope. It wasn't just about the land or the money. It was about the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken, of reestablishing a connection that he had thought was gone forever. Jonah didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't walking alone anymore. It wasn't a clean slate, not by any means, but it was a step toward healing, and for Jonah, that was enough. The journey Jonah had taken over the past few months had been nothing short of transformative. From being the forgotten, ignored figure in his family, his life had completely shifted. The discovery of the rare earth deposit beneath his land had sparked a chain of events that had rewritten the story he had been living for years. But now, standing in front of the workshop that had once been his sanctuary, Jonah could see just how much had changed, not just in his circumstances, but in himself. The evening sun cast a warm golden glow across the property as Jonah stood in the yard, his gaze lingering on the familiar aging structure of the workshop. It had been the place where he'd spent countless hours restoring old furniture, fixing tools, and working on projects that meant something to him. It had been more than just a building. It had been a reflection of his life, his values, and his quiet dedication. Yet, as Jonah looked at it now, something had shifted. The workshop no longer felt like the heart of his world, at least not in the way it once had. Jonah had built his entire identity around his work, his family, and the land. He had been content in his solitude, accepting that his legacy was tied to the past. But the discovery had shattered that sense of finality. The opportunity that had come from what was once perceived as worthless had shown Jonah something he had forgotten: the power to shape his own future. It wasn't just about the rare earth deposit or the wealth that had come with it. It was about the realization that he could take control of his life, his choices, and his destiny. As he stood there, Jonah thought about his family. The strained relationships with Stan, Lucas, and even David had been painful, but they had also been necessary. He had needed to see them for what they truly were: a family that had taken him for granted, and one that only valued him when he had something to offer. Yet, as much as he had once longed for their approval, Jonah realized that he no longer needed their validation. He had found his own path, one that didn't rely on anyone else's expectations or judgments. The conversation with David, the apology that had come from his son, had been a turning point. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was a beginning. Jonah wasn't looking to recreate the past. Instead, he was moving forward, building a future that was entirely his own. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone, not Stan, not Lucas, and not even David. His value wasn't tied to his family's approval. It was tied to the choices he made and the way he chose to live his life from here on out. Jonah took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that the future was uncertain, but it was no longer something to fear. The fire inside him, the one that had burned low for so long, was now a steady flame, and Jonah was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that he was finally the one in control.